We are in the middle of the worst refugee crisis in modern history. I mean, larger than the refugee crisis after World War II.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jed Macosko at academicinfluence.com and Wake Forest University. And today we have as our guest Professor Marcia Inhorn from Yale University, who's an anthropologist. And she specifically studies the people groups of the Middle East, and including people from the Middle East who have become refugees in the United States. So I just wanted, since that's your new book, I thought we would start there. Professor Inhorn, tell me a little bit about things that you've learned specific to people from the Middle East who speak Arabic compared to other refugees. I'm sure you bump into other refugees when you're looking for the people that you're trying to specifically study. And are there big differences?
Oh, yeah, thank you for asking that question. I'm really glad to be here. Yeah, the U.S. has been a welcoming country throughout its history, and people from all over the world. I mean, we have a real immigrant story in this country. And then I would say, really, in the post-World War II period, refugees really started coming into this country sort of in different waves. The Middle Eastern refugee sort of influx into the U.S. started, I would say, in the 1950s and 60s with Palestinians coming to this country, followed in the 1970s and 80s by Lebanese coming into the country because of the civil war that occurred in Lebanon. And then, if we all remember, there was the first Gulf War in 1990 and 1991, which then started a wave of Iraqis, especially from southern Iraq, coming into the United States in the 1990s. And then, the 2000s and 2010s have seen additional groups of Arab refugees coming from not only Iraq, that continues, but Syria, obviously, the sort of influx of Syrians. And I would add Afghan refugees. They're not Arabic-speaking refugees, but, we've had a long war in Afghanistan. And so there are Afghans coming into the U.S. as well. This is a sort of untold, little-known story. I mean, I don't think most Americans really think about the fact that we have refugees coming from the Middle East and refugees coming from other parts of the world. There are refugees obviously coming from parts of Africa where there has been, political violence and war. There were refugees that came during the, breakup of Yugoslavia and the horrible violence that happened in Yugoslavia. So there are Bosnian refugees in the United States. There are refugees from parts of Southeast Asia in this country, Cambodia and Myanmar. So America has many different refugees. I mean, and let's talk about in the 1980s, refugees came after the Vietnam War as well. There were really thousands of refugees that came into this country. So America has this history of taking in people who are suffering and fleeing from, violence in war-stricken countries. And this includes people who fled from the Middle East. Really, I would say the primary populations being Palestinians, Lebanese, Iraqis, and Syrians. And I ended up really focusing on this Arab refugee population because before I came to Yale as a professor, I was a professor at the University of Michigan, and I'm a Middle East scholar. And there in Michigan really has the largest North American Arab population. It's a huge population living mostly in the areas around Detroit. And I thought, wow, there's a Middle Eastern population right at, within an hour's drive from Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so I started heading there, going back and forth for 5 years. I did a really big study in what they call Arab Detroit, the capital of Arab America, and working in a health clinic because I am a medical anthropologist. And this is where I found a lot of people suffering and, including a lot of people who had come as refugees suffering from health problems that they were having trouble overcoming. And so that really became the basis of my study and my book, which is called America's Arab Refugees, Vulnerability and Health on the Margins. People, I must say, not living in really good circumstances, rather impoverished, and not having great access to good health care.
So what did you find about that group specific to that group as opposed to maybe other refugees you came across? Do they all have similar problems with access to healthcare, or Was there certain specific problems that the Arab refugees were facing?
Yeah, I mean, when refugees initially arrive in the United States, they're given now about 8 months of assistance, both cash assistance and healthcare assistance. But there's a real push then at 8 months for people to find their own employment and sort of get on their feet. And to tell you the truth, 8 months isn't very much time. When Vietnamese refugees came to the States in the 1980s, they were given 3 years of assistance, 3 years of cash assistance, healthcare, and assistance with language. And because of that, 3 years, I mean, Vietnamese refugees have done remarkably well in this country. They actually, I mean, often they have, in terms of median income and education, they're actually doing better than many other populations in this country. So one could say that overall, Vietnamese refugees really were a success story. We helped them as a country, and they succeeded. But now, I mean, and this has to do with welfare reform and a lot of policy decisions that were made in the last, few decades. Refugees who come really don't get long-term assistance, and they're expected to sort of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and make it. And what we know happens now in the US is that refugees are sort of under a great deal of pressure to get jobs quickly. And because of that, they end up often going into very low paying kinds of jobs. And they often have to work two or three of them in order to make, enough money basically to feed their families. And so that pressure really leaves people in a bad place, often without medical insurance, without sort of a good social safety net. And what I found in my particular study was, a group of people who were mostly impoverished, mostly didn't have medical insurance, mostly didn't really have even cash to basically cover office visits. And in my particular study, I was dealing with people who had reproductive health problems. They were struggling. They really wanted to have children. And I should say that for people in the Middle East, the vast majority of them are married, and the vast majority of them want to have children. It's a very child centric sort of region of the world, very marriage oriented and also very child centric. And so these were people who sort of had to flee from their homes. They came to America. They got what we would call low wage jobs. And they wanted to have a child and were struggling to have a child. And so I found a lot of infertility problems. And if we want to get into the sort of reason is, war is not good for reproductive health. A lot of people had been through harrowing war experiences, including men in my study, men who'd been exposed to, things that are, materials used in war that are really not good for human reproductive health. So there was a lot of male infertility in this particular population, people suffering and didn't have the money that they would need to try to use some of the forms of assisted reproduction that, might have solved their infertility problems. So my book is really just looking at the effects of poverty, marginalization, discrimination, lack of a social safety net, and what happens to people who are suffering from a problem that they dearly want to overcome in a country that's kind of forgotten them. I mean, to be quite honest, the sort of politics are America hasn't really done well by its Arab refugee population.
So, does that lead to the kind of unrest that might bring about pockets of dissent against the United States? I mean, we know obviously in the 9/11 attacks, there were Arab Americans living in the United States, or at least Muslim Americans. Is that where that comes from? Or can you explain that for the totally clueless audience like me, where all that came from?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the major points that I want to refute in my book. I mean, I
Okay,
must
good.
say, no refugee of any kind from any place has ever committed an act of terrorism on US soil.
Wonderful. Thank you for
Refugees,
putting that at rest. So even though they're sad, that's never happened that they turn against the United States that welcomed them out of the war-torn region that they were from.
no, most
So,
feel gratitude to be safe, to
okay.
have been allowed to come to a place of relative safety, right? And so refugees are not a dissenting, politically agitating group of people. They're here. They're glad to have brought their children off into safety if they have children. They want to start over. They want to start over, and actually they want to have the American dream. I mean, most of them
Mm-hmm.
would like to have a house. I'll tell you, a lot of refugees who come are actually educated people who had good positions and professions back in the home country. And one of the sad sorrows is that they probably, in many cases, will never be re educated and recertified to practice their professions in this country. So you'll
Mm.
see doctors, engineers, lawyers, who come and they end up doing jobs that are really honestly beneath their professional skills and sort of level. But
Mm-hmm.
so no, the refugee situation is not, we don't want to connect it. We want to disconnect it from, sort
Thank
of
you.
notions of Muslim radicalism and I mean, my whole book is really about the moral responsibility I feel of the US to take in Arab refugees, particularly because the US is responsible for several of the major wars in the region that have ended up displacing people from their homes, and particularly Iraq, but also Afghanistan. So,
Mm-hmm.
my book is really saying if you destroy somebody's home and country, you have a responsibility to help the people whose lives were destroyed. And I spend a
Well,
lot of
that
time in this book really focusing on the Iraqi population.
okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that for me, and I'm glad I asked a really slightly obnoxious question so that you could really clarify that.
It's an important,
And
really important question
yes,
for the US.
I
Nobody thinks about this population, and they're a law abiding population that wants
mhm.
to succeed here.
And you've written the book about it. You've made it known to the whole world what this group of people faces and how precious they are to the United States. Where do you want to go next with your research?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, um, this research for me, this piece of research is done. I mean, I completed it and I've written the book, but I am very committed to really promoting anthropological and other kinds of work focusing on the situation of Middle Eastern refugees in other parts of the world as well. So, actually, right now, we have a book that is going to be coming out next year called Unsettling Middle Eastern Refugees: Regimes of Exclusion and Inclusion in the Middle East, Europe, and the United States, looking at where Middle Eastern refugees have ended up, whether they're being settled or unsettled, whether they're being given safe haven in different countries in the world. And so I've been, I would say, a senior anthropologist that's really mobilized a group of junior colleagues around the world who are doing really important work on the situation of refugees in a number of different countries, especially in Europe.
Can Yeah, can you share where in Europe your junior colleagues have done their work?
Yeah, you probably remember 2015 was the real crisis year in terms of refugees pouring into Europe, often in very unsafe conditions, coming in small dinghies from Turkey and parts of the Mediterranean trying to reach Europe. And so those people landed in particular places. They landed in Greece. Greece still has a huge refugee population. So there are anthropologists working in Greece, but then, refugees, I would say, particularly Syrians, there's a huge, population of Syrians who've made it into Europe. And they've spread out. I mean, some Syrians have made it to Norway, to Finland, to Scandinavia, to parts of, Western Europe, France, the Netherlands. I have a doctoral student who's working with Syrian refugees in both France and the Netherlands. So I would say Western Europe and Scandinavia did receive some of these refugees coming, especially in the 2015 to 2020, period. But again, the sad part is that Europe, parts of Europe, progressive countries in Europe also have closed their doors to many people who really would, like to gain citizenship and access to parts of Europe. And so there are still many millions of refugees who are actually stuck, if you will, in neighboring Middle Eastern countries. If you really look at the total population of Arab refugees, the majority of them are still in the Middle East. They're in the
Mhm.
countries primarily of Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon. Those are probably the three countries that have taken in the largest number of Syrian refugees. They're neighboring countries where Syrians really fled over the border. And, a country like Lebanon, a country that I love, I spent one of the happiest years of my life with my family in Lebanon doing a project there. Lebanon's a small country that's having a lot of problems of its own, including, as you probably recall, a huge explosion in downtown Beirut that really displaced 300,000 people. Yet Lebanon, this small country, has taken in 1.5 million Syrian refugees. They are still there 10 years on, going no place. It's not safe for them to go back to Syria. And so, countries in the region are trying to grapple with this huge population of people who've been displaced. And so if we look at the three countries that have had the largest numbers of forcibly displaced people, it's Syria in the last 10 years, Iraqis since the US war in Iraq, since 2003, Iraqis, huge numbers have had to flee, and Afghans because of the long US war in Afghanistan. I mean, to be quite blunt, the US has started and perpetuated two major wars in the Middle East since the year 2000. The first being in Afghanistan. It started in 2001. It's the longest war in modern US history. It's still going on. It hasn't ended. And in Iraq, in 2003, we started the second Iraq war. It's called Operation Iraqi Freedom, but it is a war that started in 2003. President Barack Obama officially ended that war in 2011, but there still are thousands of American troops on the ground in Iraq. So neither Iraq nor Afghanistan are stable countries. People are still being displaced from them. And then there is the Syrian refugee crisis. It's really daunting. I mean, it's a daunting situation of people being forcibly displaced. We are in the middle of the worst refugee crisis in modern history. I mean, larger than the refugee crisis after World War II. It is a major humanitarian crisis. And I'll add another humanitarian crisis to that list, one not started by our country, but Yemen is in a terrible crisis because of a war going on between a number of Middle Eastern countries in the Gulf. And it is, I think that UNHCR calls it the worst humanitarian crisis going on in the world right now. And again, one that we pay very, very little attention to. So a region that I care deeply about. The Middle Eastern region has got so many wonderful things about it, but just the perpetual political violence, partly the responsibility of the US, is very heartbreaking to me as a scholar. That I've spent 30 years devoted to the region. And so, to answer your question and wrap it up, I feel like the one thing that I am trying to do is trying to sort of bring to the world awareness of this refugee crisis and to bring the work of junior scholars sort of out into the world as well, with a book that'll be coming out next year called Unsettling Middle Eastern Refugees.
And it seems like the main point of that book is just awareness.
It is.
Is there, like there was with the earlier book about refugees in the United States, this sort of message that they're not the terrorists, they're the ones that are trying to live out the American dream, and they've just not been given quite enough assistance. Is there some sort of take-home application message to the new book that's coming out? Or is it just more awareness?
Yeah, no, I think that we called it, regimes of exclusion and inclusion. Really looking at the ways that, yes, refugee populations are marginalized, they're turned away, they're not given citizenship rights and so forth. But there are places in the world and good people in the world who are doing the best that they can to try to include and to sort of integrate refugee populations into local communities. The book has a lot of really positive examples, too, of places that have, been welcoming. Parts of Germany have been incredibly welcoming. Parts of Scandinavia have been incredibly welcoming to refugees. And parts of America have been incredibly welcoming, including, I'm going to say, New Haven, Connecticut. I'm very proud to be living in New Haven, Connecticut. It's a safe haven community. We have a very active refugee resettlement agency here called Iris. And we are a community that's taken in its fair share of Afghan, Iraqi, and Syrian refugees. And there are a number of amazing local catering, food, refugee food nonprofits that have been developed in New Haven to give refugee women chefs a chance to, make delicious meals and to sort of serve our local community. There's a lot of activism for refugees going on in Connecticut, and I feel very proud of it. And actually, at the end of my book, I sort of put the showcase on New Haven and Yale University for all of the good work that it's doing to help legally, economically, to really support the local refugee population. Another really important point, I think I need to say this, a lot of the refugees who've come to the US who have been allowed in recent years, they're called CIVs. They have special immigrant visas. And why is that? They're the ones who helped US troops on the ground in Iraq and in Syria and Afghanistan. There's been sort of special programs to make sure that men and women who helped the US in its various operations in the Middle East also that they do get entrance to this country. So I think if there's one group of refugees coming to the U.S. from, the Middle East now, it's particularly men who help translate, drive, do work with American troops, and so they've been given special priority, especially over the last 4 years, I would say.
Wow, that's great. What an uplifting bunch of things that you have brought to the attention of the world through your great anthropological skills. And we are so honored to have had you on the show. Thank you very much for spending the time with us. And we look forward to reading your book.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And thank you so much for focusing on this latest and I think pretty important book. Thank you so much.